Listen, in the spirit of DevOps and agility and agile software practices, we've reduced the panel down to 3. Phil couldn't make it today, so we're going to ask, obviously, Todd to represent sort of the public sector, but I'll ask Gene and Brian to sort of consider themselves from a private sector perspective. How many people are public sector in the audience today? How many are private sector? Okay, good. So the format of today, I'm going to do a quick little introduction. Then we're going to have a series of questions I'm going to ask the panelists on an individual basis to answer. And then I'm going to open up to the floor, and I think we have microphones at the back of the room. It just makes it handier for, yes, the guy waving the microphone in the back of the room. It just makes it a bit easier to record the audio into the video that we're recording for today's event. So thank you, Claude. I'm really excited to host this executive panel today. Please, if you got questions, ask the questions. We did an event yesterday in Edmonton. We had a tremendous dialogue. And if you got a question, think about what you want to ask Gene or Todd or Brian today, right now. Today's topic is facilitating a discussion around DevOps, digital transformation, and the technologies that enable modern innovation. And I'm getting older, so I'm going to put on my reading glasses here. Mark Andreessen penned the famous Why Software is Eating the World essay in the World Street Journal like 7 years ago now. Can you believe it? Today, the idea that every company needs to be a software company is considered almost cliche. Digital transformations everywhere and the focus of the boards and the CEO's agendas. In fact, one of my customers, TMX, which owns a lot of the stock exchanges within Canada, I read the Q2 financial report from this year, and they're talking about blockchain and distributed ledgers. Can you believe it? Business people talking about very deep technical things. So, and with that sort of background, I'm going to ask the panel to introduce themselves, their roles. I think Gene and Brian, we know who you are. So maybe Todd, I will open it up to you to introduce yourself, your role within the province of British Columbia.
Great. Thanks, Michael. Can everybody hear me all right? Great. Hi there. I'm Todd Wilson. Thanks for having me here today. I work with the province of British Columbia as part of the BC Developers Exchange. We are a group within the overall Office of the Chief Information Officer that works across ministries, engaging government with broader public sector and the tech sector in BC and also the private sector to try to reinvent how the government does tech. So we have been on that journey now for 3 years. We've been working in the open. We have a really strong belief that open source and open development, open APIs and open data is a really strong cornerstone of that whole activity. We're trying to work towards a more transparent government, a government that engages directly with its citizens to develop solutions, and a government that partners directly with the tech sector and private sector to deliver value to citizens.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Todd. And sort of on that note, a lot of my customers are asking, what was that specific purpose, or what was that reason, what was that driver to go down this sort of DevOps or agile methodology path? What was that compelling event? What was the purpose of sort of initiating this?
Sure. The compelling event for us was really application development in government had atrophied to the point that it was pretty much impossible to deliver. We had business units that were, trying to tackle very real social problems, real business problems, and it was taking years and years and years to eventually fail and not deliver. And so this was a pattern that we had seen over and over again. So we took a step back and said, okay, how do we make this better? DevOps wasn't the immediate answer. We didn't really know DevOps was a thing when we started. We just knew that we had problems. And our problems was, to put it bluntly, speed of delivery. We knew speed was a problem. So many barriers in trying to get an app out the door. So we took a look at who we needed to work with. We had a partnership opportunity and a partnership discussion with the service provider in our data center, with the vendors that we deal with that provide us software solutions, and with the business areas. And we had a talk with them that we wanted to try to make the situation better. And so we found an early adopter in the Environmental Assessment Office. And this was right after the Mount Polley mine disaster. So the tailings pond broke in Mount Polley. For those of you that don't know about that, there was a big ecological disaster, lots of trees down, fish dying, water polluted, people upset. What happened in the Ministry of the Environment and in the Environmental Assessment Office is the press, all of a sudden, the phone was ringing off the hook. They wanted to know, was this mine compliant? Who inspected this tailings pond? Was that dam, sound? Who were the engineers involved? All of these questions, their internal processes couldn't keep up with the questions. They were literally staying up at night, going through filing cabinets, trying to find the data and the information in order to answer these questions to the press. So they knew they had two problems. One was an internal process and data problem, and the other one was a transparency problem, because all of a sudden, even though they were trying to answer these questions to the press, they found that they were getting accused of hiding details and not being transparent. So they're trying their best to do their job and then kind of getting hung because of it. So we identified them as a key partner, that we could deliver value, we could deliver them an app and work with their team to build that app, do it quickly, get it out to the public, be transparent in our processes, and then try to show value to the customers. And the customers there being citizens, concerned environment, and also the companies who are building these mines. So we put all the backlog out on Trello in the public. We started coding in GitHub in the open and created a new application for the Environmental Assessment Office. And we had their first release running in Docker in DigitalOcean within, I think it was about 8 weeks. This was unheard of in government delivery at that point in time. Nobody even considered that as a remote possibility. And yes, we bent and broke a lot of rules to get there, and that was kind of part of the point. What we did then is we took a look back and said, okay, bending and breaking these rules is actually a bit of a good thing. What if we call that a Pathfinder? And we allow the Pathfinder application team to bend and break rules as they go, and then come back and inform the enterprise on, well, you know what, if we change this policy or we change that rule or we allow teams to work in this way, this becomes our new repeatable process. This becomes our new policy. So that's how we ended up on the DevOps journey. Our raw Docker in DigitalOcean turned into OpenShift running in our Kamloops data center, and that one team delivering one app for the Environmental Assessment Office. Now we have 16 teams working in that OpenShift cluster, and we have 21 applications in production, and the sky's the limit. We're moving forward.
Excellent, thank you so much. Maybe Gene, what patterns, and Brian, what patterns do you see on the private sector in terms of those compelling events or those raw reasons of why companies adopt a DevOps approach?
I just love the story, just because we had breakfast this morning, and it's I think the pattern is very noticeable. You have a group of renegade people who know what the business objective is. They're trusted enough where they're allowed to break these rules. These bureaucracies have been built up over decades. And they're given I presume you were held accountable to a result. You can't just break all the rules. You're doing it for a reason, right? To serve citizens, the ministry objectives. And one of the things I've noticed studying the DevOps enterprise community for 4 years is something like a third of them have been promoted at least once over the previous couple of years. A lot of them more than once. And to me, this is just my interpretation of that is that these people have created such organizational value that is so indisputable that they're being promoted, essentially being asked to make a bigger contribution to the organization. Often, sometimes as a line manager, sometimes as an individual contributor, saying, look, your goal is to elevate the state of the practice for thousands, of engineers across, complex enterprises. Actually, this is a really great book on this that I just love. It's called The Other Side of Innovation, and it's written by 2 professors at Dartmouth University in the business school. And it's Dr. Govindarajan and Dr. Chris Trimble. And essentially, they studied what they called disruptive innovation. They said, why is it so hard for large, successful, complex organizations to transform? And it's usually because, and so successful meaning multi-billion-dollar organizations, growing decade over decade. And they said, the path to sustain greatness is you have to have repeatable processes, right? You have to have great daily operations from customer service to sales, marketing, product development. And so they studied the first small tractor line at John Deere, the first trail running shoe at Timberline, the first BMW electric car project. And they found that for the first successful digital operation at New York at the Wall Street Journal, and they said in every case what they needed to do was pull someone outside the bureaucracy, give them the freedom to break the rules, and it has to be, the person leading the initiative has to be someone trusted by the organization, someone who knows this person has the best long-term objectives of the organization at heart. And when I read this book, it just, reminded me of almost every one of the DevOps enterprise transformation stories. It when you, in our conversation this morning, it certainly seems like that's the pattern at play. What's interesting is that these leaders, they come from dev and operations and even chief architects, right? They're all being elevated, which I think is just really important. I think I'm going to even try to do a formal survey among the 200 plus DevOps enterprise case studies, just to see to what extent, and among the attendee population too, how much are these people been promoted? Are they being promoted at a rate higher than the broader population? I suspect the answer is going to be decisively yes. Does that resonate with you?
Sure does. I think there's a ton of opportunity for people to sort of step out of traditional siloed roles, get more involved. What we're seeing with our teams that we're developing in new ways, we're building agile teams, the excitement that comes out of these teams working directly with the business, working in sort of an innovative space, having the shackles kind of let off and have their creativity allowed to flow. It's a really compelling work environment, and we've had job satisfaction survey results come back, with marked, double-digit increases in job satisfaction from people. That's been fantastic.
By the way, what's interesting to me, I mean, it was just in terms of cultural patterns.
Yep.
The leaders who are driving these transformations. Here's one statistic: across the DevOps Enterprise Summit. Speaker population, the top title was Director of Operations, which was kind of surprising. We thought it would be sort of like rogue dev managers, just so frustrated with operations, they're just marching straight to the cloud on their personal credit card. But I think what this shows is that often there's an operations person who sees the better way, and they are adopting these kind of radical technologies to increase developer productivity. The second most prevalent title was Chief Architect. And the third one was Director of Development. I just thought that was interesting because it's very different than the sort of the narrative I had in my head. The second thing that was interesting is that the titles, directors, is people in general close enough to the technology, right? They're not so senior where they're living purely in the realm of spreadsheets and budgets. They're people close enough to the work that really see there is something terribly wrong with the way that we're working that's sucking the will to live out of everyone it touches, right? And they're showing this better, joyous way, right, that affects outcomes, affects morale, retention, and it creates happier people.
Yep. Yeah, we've seen that for sure. There's government is very famous for bureaucracy, and we've got plenty of it. We're famous for a reason. When you start to use that bureaucracy for different purposes, it actually starts to present itself as a bit of a strength. So kind of what you're saying, that middle management layer, that director layer, have been traditionally very disabled in government. They're the ones that get squeezed. When we start working with these teams, we typically have a director as our product owner in these teams, and they are one of the ones that are having the highest job satisfaction report. They're coming back saying they love working this way. This is great. They feel very enabled. They're able to make decisions without all of the normal bureaucratic layers in place, and it's a very compelling way for them to work.
That's really interesting because I think sometimes I see the other part where, especially in ops leadership, and some of my best friends are in ops leadership. But I think there's a common narrative that says, wait a minute, I thought my job was to have a bigger budget next year, and I thought my job was to grow my department, and I think often some are very threatened by it. And I was just on a webinar with Mick Kirsten and some other folks where someone was relaying a story in the government agency that it came up to Stephen Maynard, who studied transformation leadership. It's like, what is my job now? I thought it was, I thought it was to get more budget. I thought it was to make decisions, to do what's left. And I imagine you've seen some of that where there's an almost existential fear of do I have any value anymore?
Yep, definitely. I think as you're bringing any change like this into an organization that has a long history, there's a threatening element to it. those sort of middle directors, especially the ones in the IT areas, were very threatened. The ones on the business side, not so much, because they have a closer relationship to that value stream, that delivery of value. What we're doing is able to reconnect the IT directors to the value stream, which is something that was lost a long time ago. So that's a really compelling connection for these sort of IT leaders to say, oh, okay, I actually see how what I'm doing makes a difference to the outcome of this thing. So a lot of that stuff was abstracted away and lost.
Excellent. It kind of begs the question, we had a question come up in Edmonton yesterday. It's around how do you solicit and put the business case together to leadership to embark on something like this? What are the tips of the trade, or what methodologies work to get leadership on board to actually execute kind of a DevOps kind of culture or project?
Yeah. We put together a really short slide deck, 6 slides. We had a very small meeting with our CIO, our chief of security, and our chief of hosting. And we sat around with those guys and said, we all agree that there's problems, right? And they were all very willing to agree. Yeah, there's problems. Our security sucks, our hosting sucks. We can't get anything done.
I love your transparency.
And so, slide number 3 is, okay, now that we all agree that everything sucks, we want to find a better way. Are you going to give us some latitude to find a better way? And they go, yeah, we think you guys might be onto something. We said, well, there's this thing called DevOps, and have you heard of it? And, slide number 4 is pretty much, no, what the hell's DevOps? So it's a thing, and we kind of explain why we are interested in it and why it's an exciting plan. And then, their next question is, well, how much is this going to cost? And so we go, well, we're going to go 100% open source. So really, it's going to cost not so much at all. We need a couple of people, and we need you to give us the latitude to deliver a working piece of value for a real business problem. So give us a partner, and then give us the freedom just to run. And we promise we'll deliver something, and it won't cost a lot. So that's how we got our endorsement to go. And so from there, we had the endorsement from the Chief Security Officer, the Chief Information Officer, and our Hosting Executive Director. And that gave us the running room for the first, gave us 6 months of running room. And we were able to release that environmental assessment app. I think we did 3 releases in the first 6 months.
Wow, good for you. Any other
Did everyone get that? All right, just write that down. It's a script. It starts with, we all agree that hosting sucks, delivery sucks.
And security sucks.
And then end of meeting.
Yeah. I think the one thing, to kind of put it in less coy terms, it's about.
I tried it and it didn't work. I got fired.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that there's a partnership necessary and there's an endorsement necessary from on high. But that endorsement doesn't mean that they necessarily need to tell you what to do. So I think it's if you're looking for your senior leaders to tell you what to do, you'll be waiting an awfully long time. If you go to them and articulate clearly that you understand what the problems are and you think you've got something that'll work and give me the freedom to give it a try, you'll probably find that they're pretty open to a lot of different ideas and willing to give things a whirl.
Interesting. The other sort of corollary question around that is, at some point when you look at agile methodologies or DevOps kind of practices, the business is involved in the daily action in terms of defining what that minimum viable product looks like. And how did you go about interacting with, if I could use the term, the business and government, how did you interface with sort of the line of business or the ministries within the government to get them engaged on a sort of a daily basis to work with you?
So we put them in the room. So we literally created a space where there was a shared room for that Agile team. And that Agile team had a business representative in the room. And the product owner of that team was from the business, not from IT. And so that instantly put skin in the game on their side as well. It also was a breath of fresh air from a transparency perspective, because normally their solutions would have been at the end of a 200-page requirements document that they wrote 2 years ago, and then a black box gets burped out to them that they're supposed to run in a data center that they don't control, and it was a very very opaque process to them. having them that tightly engaged on a daily basis, that they're in the room with the developers, getting the job done, and then we're there sort of as the platform team, working with them on a daily basis, making the process better, understanding the policies that need to change, understanding where the friction points are, understanding what their business needs are. And that whole process was a very empowering thing. So get them in the room.
Did you?
But just to resonate off of that, I mean, one of the, in 2014, the most popular talk at the DevOps Enterprise Summit was a very surprising one. It was Mark Schwartz. He was for 6-7 years, he was the CIO of the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which in the United States is tucked inside the Department of Homeland Security. It was just a very surprising, talk, just because, here's a person who is trying to help reduce adjudication times for, green cards, refugees, and so forth. I mean, it was just a mission everyone could connect to, and doing this inside of one of the most bureaucratic organizations, in the U.S. government. And of all the talks, that was the one that resonated. And he's coming out with a book that's coming out, I think, in weeks, called A Seat at the Table. And there's a very provocative claim in there, where he's essentially what he's suggesting is that in 10 years, the distinction between the business leader and the technology leaders is basically going to disappear. That is really an artificial distinction. And I just found that so provocative and obvious in hindsight, right? Is that, in some ways, how can you lead an organization if you don't understand what the technology can and can't do and how it can really help achieve organizational outcomes? And so I just love that because, I think what you're suggesting, right, is that, it's pretty clear to me, right, the people who are driving these efforts, increasingly they're going to be the people, helping, almost defining the organizational objectives. And that distinction between the business and IT is, will quickly disappear. I'm not being too provocative.
Yeah. So there was two things that you highlighted, and they were small, but I kind of want to point these out to people. So there's a couple things that we see from companies that are successful about this. So the first one you mentioned, like physical proximity to people. So there's two things that techies kind of tend to kind of ignore, right? One of those is we're so used to doing things online, whether it's an email or Slack or something, like we're incredibly comfortable with being like, my communication is through my fingers and the screen, and the other person will understand my emotion, and they will get like.
And if I put it in all caps.
If I put it in all caps, or I put an emoji on the end of it, or whatever. But like, there is a certain amount of when you're trying to make change happen, you're trying to get, like, physical proximity is really important. And I know we complain sometimes we can't work from home or whatever. We've seen it in the dojos at places like Target and others where you will physically come with your team and work in some location for a couple of weeks. We see it with the online innovation labs. You saw it physically. We see it in cases where, you go, security's the problem with our DevOps team. Like, bring your security people into your meetings. Bring them in to sit near people. Help them understand what problems you go through, right? So that thing is very important. It doesn't mean everybody needs to move to one location, but having some amount of physical proximity, especially at those early stages, is really important. The other thing that techies never tend to want to do inherently because it gives us hives is marketing, right? But you mentioned a concept, right? When you guys would go build your early stuff, you called it a pathfinder. You gave it a name, right? And the thing that you have to remember in this is you don't need a coat. You don't need to look all fancy to be marketing. But if you tell people that what you're doing is different and you don't name it differently, you don't make it look any differently, to people from the outside, they're going, yeah, they're doing that IT thing that I don't like, that I think is too slow, that isn't secure. The companies that are successful at this, they give their project a name, they create some amount of branding around it, so people go like, what is that thing? Why are you all wearing those red t-shirts? What is that signage that you have around that says like 12, number of deploys today, 12, and then it was scratched out, and it's like that stuff, while it seems sort of minor or petty if you think that marketing is this horrible, terrible thing, is important because it allows you, again, to tell your story. It allows you to tell people, like, highlight that you're making changes and highlight that, hey, we're doing things different, and it's for the business. We're trying to make it better. So little things that you guys may want to think about, proximity.
It really does help
storytelling.
create purpose, and a purpose that's a little bit separate than, being part of the IT team and doing a new project. You want to have distinct, separate purpose to the engagement. Maybe, Todd, you could just sort of, at a high level, or highlight sort of the journey and Red Hat's role in terms of how we partnered and collaborated together to get to where you are today.
Sure, yeah. I mentioned partnerships right at the start, and I think Red Hat's been a key player in that partnership right from day one. Our awareness of the difficulty of running raw Docker drove us into the open arms of Red Hat. We
Waiting arms.
So we were pointed towards OpenShift Origins as, well, if you guys are trying to do Docker and Kubernetes, why aren't you just using OpenShift Origins? And so it being open source and government procurement being as hard as it is, that was a really attractive process for us. So we could actually just run Origins as is. We stood it up. We threw the app that we were working on into it, and it's like, wow, that's going to make a really huge difference. The platform is going to make it easier for developers. It's going to make it more palatable for the data center because there's a support model around this. You know, they already trust Red Hat as, you know, we're using RHEL in the data center already. If we bring them to the table at an early stage, we can sort of de-risk a lot of this in people's minds. It won't be just a bunch of yahoos running with open source tools going, yeehaw, the internet burped out a new toy today. Like, look what I got. It's a real enterprise solution at that point. So Red Hat came to the table in a really strong way. We did a couple developer days in the early days in order to get a community forming. So we didn't want the Pathfinder team just to be a special snowflake. We wanted to make sure that the devs all around Gov were aware of what we were doing and had an opportunity to have their hands on the same tools that we were using. So Red Hat came to town in Victoria. We opened up a room about this size with about this many people who showed up and did a hands-on developer day with Red Hat. That was super successful. And then from then on, sort of Red Hat has sort of been, side by side with us, arm in arm, in trying to figure out new ways to drive value for the community, trying to figure out new ways to drive value for the dev teams that are using this platform. And then now we're moving into the mobile development space, and Red Hat is there helping us as well.
You know, over breakfast, when you had mentioned what you were doing for the dev teams, I mean, I was envious. I went through my own sort of putting some apps into Docker and into Kubernetes, and there was some pretty frustrating weeks that went by where I'm just trying to figure out how to wire things up to a database, and it was just as crappy as 10 or 20 years ago. And just I would have loved to have had some internal team that could say, hey, could you just wire this up for me? There's a certain category of work I just don't want to do anymore. And to have an ops team to be able to help with dev enablement like that is just incredible. Whenever there's this model where you have an internal team helping developers get onboarded into internal platforms is such, I mean, it's just, it always helps to have friends who can help you do that. I mean, that's all I can say.
I want to ask you a follow-up question. So one of the things that we would see a lot of these DevOps days, DevOps roadshow events, or we just get them all the time. People go like, how do you move from that POC group, that minimum viable product group, to more and more people using the platform? You talked about having initially one team. You've now got like 16 teams. Yep. Is that like, how did you do that? Because that means going to multiple teams and saying like, hey, yes, you're going to be part of this thing that's successful, but I also want you to do things differently. Like, can you give any tips as to how you scaled it?
Yeah, absolutely. So back to your marketing and sales. I mean, sales for tech people is a bit of a dirty word as well, but we had an internal sales initiative where we went around branch to branch, ministry to ministry, and told the story of what we're doing, who we are, why we're doing it, and if you want to get involved, come on along. So that was our initial ticket. That was to try to identify people around the organization that were interested, engaged enough to show up to one of our song and dance shows, and then also interested enough to come to one of these dev days and get their hands on the keyboard. From that, we started to get candidate early adopter projects. So different business areas would come and would be super keen. We're like, yeah, we want to get involved. We love what you guys are doing. How do we get involved? And so that made us able to go back to the CIO and the senior leadership and make the case for scaling this out. We've got 12 other ministries that are interested in doing this, and they've come to our developer days, and they've shown up, and they're on our Slack channel, and they're asking questions, and they want to be involved. We need more money to scale this up. Can we do that? So then, of course, the answer was yes. We also made sure that we had engagement from the top of the house. So in order to drive change, we wanted to make sure that change was known as the motivation for doing this. So we had the head of the public service at the time was Kim Henderson. We crafted a participation invitation through her office. So if a team was going to come and use our platform and start doing DevOps transformation of their group, that was an endorsed activity from the head of the public service. She didn't really know what DevOps was, and she really had no idea what we were doing. But what that did was that gave the clarity of purpose to this team is, oh, this is actually an endorsed activity. This is what our company is supposed to do. And that way, the behavior and the behavior patterns that we were driving, it helped us make sure that we weren't just going to slip into old patterns and, well, this is the way we always do it, so let's do it this way. It's like, no, this is different. We're doing a new thing, and we're driving change. And that change is being driven from the top of the house. So we currently still have that invitation model to get into our OpenShift cluster. Our OpenShift cluster is not an orderable item that anybody can just come in and use. We kind of kept that, bouncer at the door that's like, are you worthy? Can you, can you come in and use this? I don't know. Show me your invite. And so that process we find brings people to the platform with the right mindset is they're coming here to change. They're not just coming here to bring their baggage and bring their old ways of doing things.
Good. Brian, I wanted to ask you a question. I think during your presentation, you talked about containers and how containers enable a DevOps kind of movement. And I was hoping maybe you could expand a little bit more on that, but also compare and contrast to, I think, really today we have a lot of virtual machines in our environments. How has containers sort of shifted toward enabling DevOps and bringing development and operations together and the cultural impacts of that?
Yeah, so sometimes we get into these conversations where people go like, can you compare containers to VMs? And we want to do that thing where we make everything a binary thing in technology. Like one wins, the other loses, the whole industry shifts. And that's not necessarily what we're trying to get at. What we're seeing with containers is kind of like I was talking about. It's a technology that in a lot of cases, developers tend to initially adopt it because it allows them to say, okay, I can package my application, right? So you're going to have sort of two types of developers. You're going to have those who just want to write code, don't even care about containers, just want to push it into Git or source control or whatever, and that's fine. Like the last thing you want to do is tell developers what to do. You put handcuffs on your developers and you will get handcuffed software. But we're seeing a lot of developers who are going, I'm hearing more about it. I can go out to places like Docker Hub, or I can go on the web and get pre-built images and so forth. So that helps with it. The bigger thing that we've seen, though, is it's not so much just about the container. It's really about the platform. And I don't say that in the context of that's my product, but I say it in the context of what, if you think about like Todd's story or others. So in order to be able to go faster, and this is what's kind of ultimately what we're driving, I need something that's going to be highly automated, which means things like I don't want to have to think about how do I get a network IP address, how do I attach myself to storage, how do I get an account, when I get on there, how do I get to a database? Like, you want the system to essentially have a lot of those constructs built in, right? I want them to be built in. I want them to be fairly self-service. People get afraid sometimes of self-service, especially on the operations side, because you think of it as a free-for-all. Self-service, in essence, doesn't exist until the operations team or the platform owner says, this is what's in the catalog, these are the quotas that go along with it, this is the way we want to think about groupings and so forth. So you essentially have defined the terms of what those things look like, and then you let developers or whoever start going, cool, I can bring what I want, you're giving me certain constructs that we can do. And what we see happened, and we saw this, so there's a company called FICO, which if anybody's got a credit card, you interact with FICO somehow, they do credit scores and so forth. FICO, in essence, their ops team said one of the things that happens from self-service is you give developers sort of a window of what's going on there. It's very similar to where I am right now. Like, I can see you sort of, but that light is really blinding, so I can only see you sort of foggy. But I have questions as a developer about, like, well, what does it mean when I connect to the database? What does it mean when I get an IP address and an ingress route or an egress route? Like, what's happening there? And what they found was, because the platform had a certain amount of transparency, it drove conversations that you didn't just say, I threw it over the wall and I hope you make this work. They said, like, can you do this? Like, I'd like the environment to do these things. Can it do this? And so it gave a certain amount of freedom to developers. It drove some conversations that people would go like, oh, okay, we're kind of sharing this space now. And again, because you had this consistency of how it was packaged, that sort of box got checked of like, I don't have to worry so much about they're just throwing it over the wall. Like, I know what they're throwing over the wall to me. So a lot of those things all mixed together are what's making some of these things go faster.
Okay. Well, I'm going to turn it to the audience now. Is there any brave souls that would like to ask a question of our panel? We do have a microphone that's floating around. Vasco has it. Any questions from the audience? Who's going to start it off?
Hello. It's a question to Gene. All of the examples I've seen have been internal. So you have, you develop your application, QA, and then deploy it. We develop software for ISPs. So we do the development and QA internally, but then for our operations, our external customers all over the world, those customers will be behind firewalls, they've got their own security teams, et cetera, et cetera. Have you seen examples like that? And do you have any recommendations where the actual operations are done by ourselves, but they're on external customers, so we can't have multiple deployments per day, et cetera?
Give me a second. That's a great question. In fact, I think Does anyone want to go first while I process my answer?
I'll give you a couple of examples. So in essence, you're asking the question of, I'm an ISV, we build the software, but we're not necessarily going to run it. Somebody else is going to run that for you. So it's for ISP or ISVs? ISPs, okay. Yeah, so we're seeing a couple of things happen, right? So one of them, not to sort of beat the container horse to death, but like we are seeing more and more software vendors who are saying, we're going to distribute what we do, package it as containers. So you'll see it like in Bitnami, in Amazon's marketplace, in Docker Hub, in something. So there's a certain consistency of packaging that we see that doesn't necessarily change how it's going to operate, but we do see that consistency that people will build those best practices. We're also starting to see more and more companies, so I used FICO as an example because we were talking about that, but FICO, another example of what they did, they used to be like you, they would distribute their software to financial institutions. Essentially, it would end up on a box appliance, and then they would run it, and then they would get a certain amount of data that came back. What they found was they actually decided to get into a new segment of the market where they offered what their software was as a SaaS application. So we're starting to see some people that are saying, I used to be in the packaged software business. There's an opportunity to change how we do distribution. We want to offer what we do as a SaaS application, and some companies are starting to do that as well. So, part of it is there's a new way that people are packaging it. Some of it is you're going to be dependent on what the best practices are of companies in terms of how they do operations. It's getting a little better. Things like Kubernetes are helping that. But there's definitely opportunities for people that want to say, I'd like to get in the SaaS business because that's what people are kind of getting used to more and more, if that's applicable to what you do.
Yeah, and maybe to expound on that just a little bit, I mean, I think one of the early case studies we had was Blackboard. So they were publicly traded, now private, but they actually had the Blackboard they would sell to higher education organizations, any place where learners are, so for learning management systems and so forth. And part of their DevOps transformation was just around how to make the releases not so catastrophically disruptive. And part of it was also supporting an online service. I mean, I think they really would like their customers not to be making customizations, which actually make upgrades harder. How to get them onto sort of a more of a service model. But they had to support both. The second thing that comes to mind, I mean, just as a kind of a pathological kind of example of a category of applications would be like SAP. And it's interesting to see a friend of mine. He was telling me about the SAP example at Michelin, where they're actually doing weekly deployments of the entire supply chain, financial reporting, and so forth. And these aren't just small little changes. These could be affecting like compliance, financial reporting. So these would be considered global changes. And so Michelin is running it. It's not SAP as a service. And it required just a huge investment in automated testing. It was really incumbent on the customer, in this case Michelin, or was it Firestone? I'm sorry. If you email me, I'll look it up. But essentially, then you're really asking your customer to sort of adopt these technical practices and so forth, because you, as a software vendor, really can't do it for them. But I mean, for them, the benefits were just huge. The fact that they could actually do these kind of business rule changes, adopt channel partners, in a week, as opposed to having to wait, 2 quarters or so forth. So I think there are some examples. In fact, that guy, Brian Kernighan, in my mind, he's like one of the best in the game at SAP, DevOps for SAP. I think he'll be presenting this year, and that might be of interest. Because if you can do it for SAP, you can do it for anything, right? I can't think of anything tougher to manage than SAP, tougher to test, tougher to deploy.
Yeah, I forgot about one that should have been more obvious to me. So Red Hat runs, so the OpenShift platform that we run originally began life as essentially a PaaS online SaaS application. You could just go on and get an environment. We eventually didn't see as much uptake of that just as an online thing. People wanted to run it on-prem, so we were in the same boat as you. We basically package software, we drop it off to customers. The challenge that we run into, and it's not driven by us, but it's driven by community. So essentially we package Docker technology, Kubernetes technology, and a bunch of other stuff. That stuff comes out every 3 months, right? That's the community life cycle. And we were running into this problem where we had a whole bunch of customers who, operations teams who were like, upgrade every 3 months. Like, I'm lucky to upgrade every year. And you run into this terrible problem where if they stick with that, now you're 4 releases behind, and like we love doing support, but you only want to do it so much. We actually made a real conscious decision about a year ago that we were going to double back down on making the online service that we had viable again. So we sort of reinstated that. But what it did for us, and we get customers that want to use the online service because they don't want to be in the operations business. But more importantly, what it did for us is it forced us to say, how are we sort of eating our own dog food in terms of doing this? Can we figure that out? Can we figure out how we're going to fix bugs in between it? But then we're also beginning to figure out how do we turn those best practices that we internally use for our online service into something that, for example, like if Todd says, hey, I'm not going to run it out there, I have to run it locally for whatever reason, compliance, governance, whatever. Like, what best practice can I get from you guys? Or what are you doing around an Ansible playbook to make it better? So the takeaway I would take from this is, if the expectation, and I've worked at places like Cisco for a long time and others where you're dropping off software and you hope they have, like, you almost have to say, look, I can't expect that you're going to do anything right on your own, even if I write it down. You may have to get into sort of the online business in order to have enough stake in the game to go, how do they deal with this stuff that I can codify it and make it a best practice, something along those lines.
Okay, great question. Any other questions out there? We probably have time for maybe 1 or 2 more.
I have a question about suitability, legacy applications for this, and are there any examples where you would say this stuff is not good for DevOps, for cloud, let it die naturally, invest better into new applications and migrate slowly? And because a lot of a core business, right? I understand you approach all this business unit and said, hey, do you want to be a part of this cool initiative? But it's all new stuff. What about legacy?
Yeah, we focused on Greenfield first off because we didn't want to die on a hard problem hill. So what you're talking about, yeah, there's hard problems there, but I think there's also a lot of opportunity there as well for really cool solutions and successes. There's challenges moving legacy applications into a Kubernetes cluster. We have had some experience doing that with some applications. We find that there's, we call it brittleness or some lack of resilience on some of those applications where they'll lose reference to persistent volumes or database connections and things like that as Kubernetes is shifting pods around that causes these applications to lose their mind. So there's always a little bit of rework. It's not just the, people say lift and shift. I think that's a really kind of doing disservice to the effort that it takes in order to get these applications into a container cluster. But maybe there's definitely room for success, and I think there's definitely value there in the exercise. So maybe if you want to add.
Yeah, lift and shift rhymes, so it's easier to sort of think through it. I think the most obvious thing that we hear from people is they'll say, database applications and mainframe applications are sort of hard to do with DevOps because, they don't want to touch them, or in the case of something like old COBOL code, I don't know who knows where that code is. Those are those are fine sort of broad brushstrokes to say, well, those are going to be hard. The flip side of it is, if you attend or watch any of Gene's videos, you will see IBM talking about doing DevOps stuff on the mainframe. You hear about Target and other folks who have to do a whole bunch of transactional stuff that are trying to figure out how to break a chunk of what they do. So there's this concept of like strangler patterns. How do I strangle off something that's I think has to change, but I'm not going to be able to change the whole thing. We see that somewhat with mainframe applications or older applications. The database technology is getting better in terms of, like, we do a bunch of work with companies like Crunchy Data who do Postgres on Kubernetes and so forth. We just saw Oracle the other day is going to put their technology in Docker in the Docker store. So the database technology is going to move along fairly quickly. They're figuring out how to deal with it in more distributed ways. The mainframe stuff really becomes how much value comes out of how much pain you want to deal with. But the good news is there are people that are standing up saying, yeah, we did it. We got some scars, but we did it.
Yeah, I mean, here's like 3 things that just dazzled me. One is you take a look at, there's a talk by Rosalind Ratcliffe at IBM, distinguished engineer, and from CompuWare, talking about their internal practices for their flagship mainframe products, including kicks and things that I have a very weak understanding of. But at CompuWare, their average age of the programmers is like 27 years old. They're hiring them fresh out of college, never seen a mainframe before, and yet they're being productive on the flagship mainframe product. It's like, okay, data point number 1. Data point number 2 is I guess there are certain categories of applications, 20 million lines of COBOL code that apparently haven't been compiled in 10 years. So like apparently they're okay with stasis. That's okay. But CSG is such an interesting example. Part of their bill printing service, of which is a $1 billion company runs upon it, like it's a 45-year-old mainframe application and COBOL, assembler, and like they need to change it. They are in the critical path of almost every new feature that their large customers need. And so they pair, so it's like in Scott Prue's mind, he said he hates bimodal IT. He's like, that's like, does such a disservice for certain categories of applications. He said in his mind, there's like 2 categories. One, applications that we need, we support, we can secure, we can patch, and the ones that we take in the back of the parking lot and, destroy with a sledgehammer, which they did to all the Solaris systems apparently like a month ago.
Right.
Yeah. Thought you'd like that. Anyway.
I love that, Gene. Thank you.
But so here's what they did with their mainframe application. They did a 3-month experiment. They paired a 55-year-old mainframe programmer with a 32-year-old Java programmer. One is wearing khaki pants with a collared shirt. The other one's wearing shorts and a T-shirt. In 3 months, this little experiment, 130,000 lines of assembler code turned into 800 lines of Java. And so and by the way, it runs in a cheaper workload, right? So this actually costs like 10% of the cost, right, to actually run, right? And so, here is something now that, for those changes, potentially those business rules can be changed by any one of 300 Java programmers in the organization, as opposed to the 20 people on the mainframe team. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I just so I think just the level of engineering heroism. These incredible feats of engineering are being done, in the mainframe space. That I have just an incredible sense of awe just seeing these transfold. And so the fact that they're on the mainframe does not mean that greatness can't be achieved.
I would also say that Corey Volke, who's talking about our Open Innovation Labs later today, he actually owned technology currency for a big green bank in Canada, one of the top 5. And he will be able to answer that question. He was responsible for getting the bank up to a current state of version. So ask the question this afternoon. I think he's on at 1:15 or so after my keynote. I guess we're down to our last question.
Yes, I'm sure that if you've had lots of conversations with many of the folks that live here in Western Canada, I'm sure you have heard the story that we're very data center, infrastructure heavy type organizations that kind of route here. I'm sure there is a lot of development in, certainly in Vancouver and a lot of different areas. But if you talk to a lot of the corporate, companies here, they're very data center heavy. So this story, the DevOps story, powerful story, it makes complete sense. do you have, like, do you change your story, or is there a way that you convey the story? I know I'm figuring out my way to convey the story, but convey the story to those companies and to those organizations that do see the business more as an infrastructure heavy, like a lot of the IT directors, even C-level executives, you know, they come from that infrastructure space as opposed to like the application delivery space. How do you change your story, or do you change your story, or is it that you just have to marry the two? Just your thoughts on that.
It goes back a little bit to the thing I was saying, that there are going to be certain things in your business that are going to be kind of intractable, right? So your business, as long as they want to stay in business, is going to want to, you know, the numbers go up every year. They want to go a little faster. They want to respond back to customers. We actually sell probably the bulk of those platforms, those container platforms, and those to the operations teams, because in essence they're saying, like, I don't always necessarily know how all this technology is going to work, but I still, at the end of the day, like, I'm still responsible when it goes down. Like, I'm still, so, you know, we talk about like Equifax, for example, and you can be on whatever side of that you want to do and make a joke about it, and they should have patched this. But at the end of the day, somebody had a really bad day, or a really lot of bad days, and they blame the infrastructure team, right? They didn't patch something, it went down, it went, so I think the thing about it is, like, there's nothing wrong with saying, like, hey, we're very data center centric, we're very infrastructure centric. I think you're gonna, everybody I know that works in infrastructure, in essence, is trying to figure out, like, do these new software constructs make any sense to us, right? Software-defined networking, software-defined storage, like, are they any good? Does it make any sense? Should I do converged infrastructure and all that stuff? Those are all things that should be top of mind, because they're going to ultimately, like, you can have the greatest SDN on top of HCI on top of whatever. If all you're doing is just sort of running the same applications over and over again and you save 20%, like, that's fine. You may very well be doing your job, but somebody in your business is going, like, we have investors, or we have the stock market, or we have whatever that want us to do better. And that's I think you're always sort of marrying those two things together, right? Like, as an operations team, you're ultimately responsible for, is it up and running? Is it secure? Does it go fast? But there's always going to be a certain amount of, like, can we get applications onto it faster? Can we deploy something faster? Can we roll them out faster? And even if you just keep it as simple as that and just say, look, those are the two things that we're kind of trying to marry or balance or whatever, like, that's perfectly fine. We did an event in California, I forget where we were, in Southern California, I forget what the name of the company was. And the guy who spoke, he was on the same panel, he said, look, I try and do DevOps, and I specifically don't call my team DevOps, because the folks that are the engineers on my team don't want to be thought of as, like, highbrow or above and beyond everybody else. They just go, we're just the IT team, and we're just trying to be better at what we do. So, you know, it goes back to that thing I said originally, like, you don't have to walk out of any of this thing going, like, there is only one blueprint and it has to work. If you call it DevOps and that works for you, cool. If you can take everything out of Gene's book and it works for you, cool. And if there's like 10 pages of it and they look like they're randomly pulled out, but that still makes you 20% faster and 15% cheaper, like, that might be awesome too. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? Like, don't feel like, it goes back to my Silicon Valley thing, like, don't feel like you have to be Airbnb if you're not Airbnb.
Yeah, the reason why I asked my buddy Brian to go first is I think a lot about that. And so I think I have, like, two things that I would put forward. One is, I mean, I think there's a certain reality that is inescapable, that life is changing in infrastructure. Right? A friend of mine, he's at a bank, he said, we had a reduction in force of 500 people. It was release managers, a lot of project managers, a lot of ops people, right? But that was actually to make room for 800 new job recs, right? Higher paying jobs, you know, anything automation related, right? Test automation, release automation, right? Everything around that. And yeah, so my first question was, did you offer retraining opportunities? And he said, absolutely, of course we did. But only 10% of the population took us up on it. And my immediate reaction was, how could it be so small, right? Why wouldn't someone, you know, jump in and, you know, just take every training opportunity? And he said the answer that came up most frequently was, all I need is one more job, right? It's like, I'm in a big metropolitan area, I can find another release management job. And I told that to my friend Tom Limoncelli, ex-Google. He wrote the server administration book, many, many books. And he said, isn't that interesting? As an ops person myself, he said, there's a kind of fork in the road that we all should see. There's down one branch, right? The only job I can get is working at the Genius Bar at the Apple Store, right? And down the other branch, I have the hottest skills in the marketplace, equally in demand from the unicorns as the horses, right? And I thought that was very, very interesting. And so I think that the call to action for any infrastructure leaders is, they should see that coming, right? In fact, someone actually told me, what a shame. As a leader, we should have headed off the 500 reduction in force. We should have found safe places in the organization. In fact, we should have internally filled every one of those 800 positions, right, among my team. I thought that was just meaningful to me. I thought that's where infrastructure leaders should be taking the organization. I think the second thing is, it's just, I might have mentioned, I self-identify primarily as a ops person for the last probably 15 years, but I've been spending more and more time coding, and it's been never as fun to be coding these days. But man, you can't really be productive coding without great infrastructure, right? I don't want to be wiring things up to a database. I don't want to. It's embarrassing, like how many days I've spent doing crappy things that, like, if I had a team of people with an internal platform like these, they would have just solved my problem for me. But there are things that like only infrastructure can do. There's this great story. Here's like the power of infrastructure and environments. There's this famous like problem they had at Google around the leap second, where they're looking at like at the leap second, where they had to add 1/4 of a second at the end of the year. It like broke just in hundreds of applications at Google, and so they're just counting. It's like a Y2K event, right? It's like, okay, how do we rewrite certain applications to make them less vulnerable to this very specific thing? And so the solution they came up with was like audacious. They actually changed the NTP servers to amortize that 1/4 second across a year. So no one had to rewrite their applications. The 1/4 second was silently, fitted in, over an entire year. Right? And so like there's certain things that you can only do kind of at the infrastructure layer. And I thought like the ops people like Google changed time, right, and avoided thousands of engineers from having to rewrite the application to handle this one boundary case. And so, it's just a great time to be in the game. That's all I can say, whether you're dev or ops.
Good. Well, I think that concludes our discussion today. Thank you so much to the panel for participating and sharing your wisdom and knowledge.